So in this lesson, we're going to build simple joint rigging for the nostril area. What we're going to do is we're going to build a 3-joint chain running from one corner of the nostril, the inner corner, to the outer corner. And we'll break that in the middle so we can bend this volume here in the center. And then we're going to build a series of outrigger joints that will point outward in the center area to give a little control over this profile. Okay, so we're going to start by building a visual guide, and I'm going to use a 1-degree spline going roughly from the inner corner here to the outer corner of the nostril. So I'm going to use point snap and then select create CV curve tool in the option box. Let me reset this. So I want to make sure the curve degree is set to linear. Close that. And so once again, with curve snap on, I'm going to click, okay, let's say right here on the inner nostril. Okay, and there for the outer. Let me hide the polygons. So now I'm going to display the CVs on this curve. Display, NURBS component, CVs. You see we have one on each end. If I open the attribute editor, we can see that we have a 1-degree spline with one span. So I'm going to rebuild this so that we have 2 spans, basically putting an extra CV in the center here. So with the spline still selected, switch to the modeling module and then select edit curves, rebuild curve, option box. Let's reset this. So I'm going to rebuild this, the parameter range, I'm going to set to 0 to number of spans, the number of spans to 2, and then make sure the degree is linear. If I hit rebuild, we could ignore the 2 CVs here. We're going to snap a joint on the first CV, the center, and the last. I'm going to switch back to the animation module. We're ready to draw our first joint. Skeleton joint tool. Once again, with point snap still selected, I'm going to click on the first, the center, and the last CVs. I'm going to quickly rename these because we're going to mirror them later on. So I'm going to search for every instance of joint and change it to cave 01L nostril. I'm going to add an underscore JNT on the end here, since we're going to add these into the skin cluster. Okay, this last one we're going to say end. I'm going to display their local rotation axis. Select all the joints and then select display, component display, local rotation axes. So first, let's orient the end joint. Skeleton, orient joint. Make sure our orientation is set to none, which means relative to its parent, there is no orientation change. I'm going to switch to component mode and toggle on the question mark icon, which so happens to select the local rotation axis. So I'm going to select all 3, display the geometry here, and just then eyeball it. I'll rotate this so it's roughly matching the plane of the nostril. So here we can see the line is going through the plane of the nostril. Okay, switch back to object mode and hide these local rotation axes. So now I'm going to create a 1-degree curve going from the center up to the outer edge and then from the center down. Hide the joints for a moment. Reactivate our CV curve tool. Once again with point snap selected. I'm going to click on the center CV here. Okay, so there's that. I'm going to show the CVs on that. And then create another curve going in the opposite direction. Here I've activated curve snap. So I can snap to an edge, which Maya sees as a curve in this sense. Okay, so with that done, let's go in and create another series of joints. Let's show our joints once again. Leave our point snap turned on. Skeleton joint tool. Create that joint. Okay, and then create this. So we have one joint pointing up and the other pointing down on the nostril. So I'm going to display their local rotation axes. I'm going to orient these end joints so that they match their parents. Skeleton orient joint tool, and it's still set to none. Now let's name these. I'm naming these joints because we're going to need to mirror them later on. Once again, using the Modify Search and Replace Names tool, I'm going to rename these to L up nostril. These will be low nostril. Change the numbering, change this to 01, J and T, and 02, end. And similarly rename this to end. And a J and T. So you can hide these local rotation axes. So next what I'm going to do is, rather than simply parenting them, and I'll parent them to illustrate. If I were to parent them and then start rotating them, and with the 90-degree rotation, approximately the 90-degree rotation, this down nostril joint folds back on itself so that it points right back toward the first nostril joint. So rather than directly parenting them, we're going to create what I like to call an averaging joint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the second nostril joint, I can delete the duplicate end joint. I'm going to rename this from J and T to AVG. I'm going to parent this up and down nostril joint to the new average joint. So I'm going to use a multiply divide note so that this nostril average joint will average the rotations that it's getting from its parent, and it will do so by negating half the rotation. So for instance, if this were rotated 90 degrees in z, I'll multiply that 90 degrees. Let's say if it's negative 90, I'll multiply it by negative 0.5, negating 45% of the rotation. Once we set up these node connections, it'll be fairly apparent what the end result is going to be. Let's open up our script editor. Let's clear this out. I'm going to start by creating a multiply divide node. Create node, multiply divide. Let's give it a name. Okay. That this is a multiply divide node is created, I'm going to open the attribute editor and make sure it's set to multiply, which is the default. Then immediately open up the connection editor. Window, General Editors, Connection Editor. So first I'm going to connect the rotation of the second nostril joint into the multiply divide node. So I'm going to load the multiply divide node into the inputs. Select the second nostril joint and load that into the outputs of the connection editor. Scroll down until I find rotate and connect that into input 1 of the multiply divide node. Now in the channel box, I'm going to click on the multiply divide node so that that's selected. Load that into the outputs of the connection editor and scroll up until I find the outputs. Then select the nostril 02 average joint, load that into the inputs, and connect the output of the multiply divide node into the rotation of the average joint. So right now, even without parenting, it behaves as if it is parenting. So I have a negative 45-degree rotation on the second nostril joint. If we look at our average joint, we have a negative 45-degree rotation in Z as well. That's because there's a direct connection. What I'm going to do is I'm going to parent the nostril average joint to the nostril 2 joint. So now when we rotate this, we're going to get double the rotation because we'll get the rotations from the parent-child relationship as well as from the node connection. You see there we're getting double the rotations. Let's set this to minus 90. What we need to do is we need to set all of the input 2 channels of the multiply divide node to negative 0.5. What that effectively does is it negates the rotations by half, which in essence averages those rotations. If we rotate to a negative 90, rather than folding back on itself, it dampens or averages those rotations. So that way we'll be able to maintain a little volume, or a lot more volume, in the nostrils here. Okay. So I'm going to clean off these joints I'll just leave them as is for now, and then do that at a later time. Okay, so here we have our full left nostril. Let's mirror that over to the right side. We're going to lose our multiply divide nodes, but we can recreate that later. So with the first nostril joint selected, I'm going to select Skeleton, Mirror Joint Tool. Make sure that Behavior is selected. I'm going to mirror and search for everything that has _L_, which is my left side token, and change that to right. And I'm going to mirror across the YZ axis, which once again cuts down the center line of the character. Okay, so there we have our right side joints. And their behaviors are mirrored. I'm going to parent these to the up jaw joint. Since this joint controls all of the nostril area, this will be the parent for these two nostril joints. So I'm going to select them, two nostril joints, shift select the up jaw joint, and simply hit P. So now when we look at our range of motion, our nostrils are behaving as we would expect. So at this point, I'm going to go in, once they're mirrored, and remove some of these channels, like the visibility and radius. I'm going to hide those. I'm going to lock and hide all of the translation channels. And let's leave the scales open. Select all the end joints. Once again, hide their visibility and radius, and then lock and hide all of the channels since there won't be any animation on these end joints. I'm going to select the up and down nostril joints. And lock and hide the translate channels. So I'm going to add these joints as influences to this mesh. So I've selected the mesh. I'll shift select the joints of the nostril. Then select skin, edit smooth skin, add influence, option box. We have our options from the last time we added joints as influences, meaning that use geometry is disabled and lock weights is turned on, since I want to have control over how these influences are added into the skin cluster. Then I'll click add. So now these joints have been added to the skin cluster, but if I rotate them, they have no effect because I've locked their influence. So now what I'm going to do is start painting the weights for these nostril joints. I'm going to create a new portion of a new set of frames for this timeline here. So I'm going to go from, let's take it all the way to 200. And 155 is the last frame. I'm going to use this to add animation onto the nostrils. So give it its own range of motion. Once again, I do this so that I can have this range of motion on the joints and just simply scroll through in the timeline and not have to constantly zero out my controls. Let's go in extreme 45 and then negative 45. Here we're going to do a little scale X. Scale them to 1.5 times their normal length. Take them back to 1. Then do the same with the lower nostril joints. Okay, so here's the range of motion we have for the nostrils. Okay, set these back to 1 on this last frame here. Okay, so here's our nostril range of motion. So once again, just touching all the joints. Okay, so now we can go in and start adding the weight influence. With the mesh selected, I can either select Skin, Edit Smooth Skin, Paint Skin Weights tool in Option Box, or I can right mouse click on the mesh, select Paint, Skin Cluster, and then select the head skin cluster, which is the only skin cluster on this object, and puts us in paint mode. Okay, so I have a solid brush at a weight of 1. Here are my right nostril joints. I'll unhold those since they were added with hold enabled, so locking their weights. And now I'm unlocking the left nostril joints. I'm going to go in and just start adding in these weights. Once again, working in a very rough manner, just getting the volumes moving. Then we'll go in later and refine this. Right now I'm working with the end joint, so the second nostril joint. Okay, now the first nostril joint. Okay, so I'm going to add the upper and then the lower. Okay, here's the lower. Just checking to see the minimum and maximum boundaries, like where I'm starting and stopping painting these weights. Okay, so I'm going to add in some 0.5 weights here. Oh, let's do this real quick. Okay, so now I'll add in some 0.5 weights just to quickly do a little averaging. Okay, so just extending this down a bit further. pull back on that. So let me go back to this up jaw here. Okay. So finally I'm going to start adding in these 0.5 weights to do the rough averaging. Okay, so on a very rough level, this is what we have for the weighting. So you can see the effect that we're going for here. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the soft brush and then to the additive tool. I'm grabbing my Wacom tablet. Okay, start painting, extending these weights further out toward the base of the nostril. Once again, just working very quickly. And just as with the main head weighting, I like to first just rough in the weights just to sort of block out a solution for the a weighting problem, so to speak. Then I'll go in and refine it. Extend this out even further. Just trying to work very fast, knowing that I can go in at any time later and add refinement to these weights. But I want to first of all test to see if the ideas will work. And then once I have that solution roughly blocked in, then I'll go in and refine it later on. But the first thing is just to get it working in a minimal sense. Because often I'll find myself needing to kick out a rig for early animation testing. Often I'll do a first pass of joint placement, do this first pass rough weighting without much refinement, and then kick it out to an animator for feedback. And then I don't want to go too far with the refinement because chances are there will be changes. They'll use controls in ways that I will not have anticipated, or want to add or reposition or change controls. So I don't want to invest too much time. I do want to get it basically working. That's what I'm doing here. Mainly not to torture you with the prospect of watching me weight this character in its entirety, but rather to show the techniques and to weight them well enough so that you can see clearly what the effect is that I'm going for with some of these rigging structures that I'm building here. Okay, let's do some more, a little further into the range of motion here. You see I'm tugging at a little bit of the skin all around. Once again, when I go in and refine it, I'll extend it out a little further even. I'm just working out the major problems at this point. I'm going to be honest in admitting that I tend not to work this fast when I'm working on a character at work, for instance. But just for the purposes of this demo, this is still the same process in terms of going in and roughing out a solution or a rough pass of weighting as quickly as possible. Not investing too much time, just getting it to work in a basic way. Okay. There we have our rough nostril weighting. Okay, once again very rough, but I'm going to mirror it over. Selecting our quick select set, which selects everything except for the center line. Then skin, edit smooth skin, mirror skin weights. Okay, very rough first pass on these nostrils, but just to show, adding these joints in, gives you quite a bit of flexibility with the deformations. So you can see that I left the scale channels open on these nostrils. So you can pinch at the base, and you can do quite a bit, as well as rotate them. Okay, so there we have very simple nostril joints. It's first pass weighting, but you can see that although they're very simple, there's quite a bit of flexibility and deformations that we can get using both the rotation and the scale